A Certain Magical Index, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Part 6. These days, 320 yen couldn't even buy a large serving of beef bowl. Medium. Girls that nibble at their tiny bento boxes wouldn't understand, but for growing, sweaty boys, medium-sized beef bowls were really just snacks. After chasing away the spark plug girl, Mikoto Misaka, he enjoyed his snack at the beef bowl place. With 30 yen, after tax, remaining in his wallet, he walked back to the student dormitory, now covered in shadow. No one was around. It was the first day of summer vacation, so everyone was probably out having tons of fun in the city. At a glance, the building looked like any old studio apartment complex. There was a line of tightly packed doors in the straight path along the wall of the square building, guarded by a portcullis-like metal railing. Since this was a boys-only dormitory, there was no miniskirt peeping prevention plastic sheets on them. The student dorm building stretched away from the road. He could see the building entrances on the sides and the individual balconies lining the gaps between the buildings. The entrances had automatic locks on them these days, but the distance between adjacent buildings was only 2 meters. It would be easy to infiltrate another building if you jumped across the roofs as Index had this morning. He had disengaged the lock, slipped past the closet they had called the administrative office, and got on the elevator. The elevator had a unique charm to it. It was even more cramped and dirtier than elevators used at construction sites, and the R button indicating the roof was blocked by a small metal plate in order to prevent roof-hopping Romeos. The elevator made a microwave-like ding and stopped at the 7th floor. The door opened with a groan. Kamijou helped push it aside, then exited onto the walkway. It was 7 floors up, but it didn't feel like a very tall building. It seemed needlessly hot and humid, maybe because of the oppressiveness of the building next door. It was then that Kamijou noticed. On the other end of the straight path, in front of the door to his own room, there were 3 cleaning robots. 3 was an unusual sight. There were only 5 cleaning robots assigned to this building in the first place. They were each moving back and forth with short, quick motions, so he thought there must be a pretty nasty mess there. For some reason, an extreme foreboding of misfortune settled over him. Those oil drum droids had enough destructive force to tear off pieces of gum stuck to the ground on main roads. Just what on earth needed 3 of them to tackle it? He shuddered. Maybe it had been his next-door neighbor Motoharu Tsuchimikado in another one of his delinquent drunken tirades aimed at losing his virginity, throwing up all over the floor there instead of on the electricity pole outside the door of his room. Just what on earth? People have a rather peculiar compulsion to witness disaster. Taking another step or 2 forward, he finally saw the source. The mysterious girl Index had collapsed on the floor from hunger. He couldn't see her whole body behind the robots, but the downward-facing white habit pockmarked with shiny safety pins made it clear she'd collapsed there. She didn't flinch, even though the 3 oil drum robots were ramming her with a rhythmic. The scene had an air of tragedy, as if city crows were pecking at her corpse. But cleaning robots were programmed to avoid humans and other obstacles. Not even robots treated her as if she was human? What was that all about? How should I put it? It's rotten luck. Kamijou muttered something along those lines. Had he checked his expression in a mirror, though, he'd have been surprised. He was actually smiling. Something inside of him had been stuck on her. Even if he didn't believe in sorcerers, the situation could have been construed as a suspicious new cult chasing around a lone girl. The fact that she'd turn up again as if nothing had happened made him happy. Even setting all that aside, he was just glad they got to meet again for some reason. Kamijou thought back to the one thing she had forgotten. The pure white hood he hadn't returned to her. Strangely, he began to think of it as a good luck charm. "Hey, what are you doing over there?" He called out, running toward her, wondering why he felt like a restless elementary school kid the night before a field trip. Each step he took reminded him of the anticipation he felt when going to a gaming store the day some massive studio's new RPG was slated for release. Index still took no notice of him. Toma Kamijou stifled a smile at her Index-like reaction, or lack thereof. It was only then that he realized. Index had collapsed in a pool of blood. Surprise wasn't his immediate reaction. Rather, it was hesitation. He hadn't noticed sooner, given that the throng of cleaning robots obstructed her, but her back had been lacerated by a horizontal slash near her waist. The wound had the appearance of having been inflicted by a sword, as if a ruler and X-Acto knife had been employed to carve a line straight through a cardboard box. Her neatly cut silver hair was dyed crimson. Human blood wasn't his immediate association. The gap in reality between this moment and the one immediately preceding rendered Kamijou dazed. Deep red ketchup? Right before she collapsed from hunger, she must have used the last of her strength to drink some ketchup. He summoned the happy imagery, trying to smile. He tried to smile, but he couldn't. Of course not. The 3 cleaning droids, squeaking back and forth in short movements, dabbed at the mess on the floor, attempting to use their mops to arrest the spread of the crimson pool. The slick red draining from Index's body. It was as if they were using a dirty cloth to staunch the wound. It was as if they were vacuuming out their insides. Stop! Stop! Shit! Finally, Kamijou's eyes adjusted to the reality before them. He tried grabbing the janitorial droids gathered in a frenzy around the gravely wounded Index. They were constructed to be stupidly heavy in order to prevent theft, and they had quite a bit of horsepower too, so peeling them off was no simple task. Of course, the automatons were only cleaning the mess expanding across the floor, and they diligently avoided any direct contact with Index. But in Kamijou's mind, these were termites come to feast around a festering wound. Despite the adrenaline fueling him, Kamijou knew a single robot was too heavy and powerful for him to peel off, much less 3 of them. When he focused on one, the other 2 went for the mess. He couldn't even budge these stupid toys, despite being the man who could kill even God. Index was silent. Her motionless lips were purple from blood loss. Whether or not she was breathing was questionable. Damn it! Damn it! Kamijou shouted impotently. The hell? What the hell is this? Who the hell did this to you, damn it? Oh, that would be us sorcerers. Kamijou turned his whole body toward the elevators as if he were about to take a swing at someone. But it wasn't the elevator. The figure seemed to have emerged from the emergency stairwell. The Caucasian man was almost 2 meters tall, but his face looked younger than Kamijou's. His age was probably the same as Index's, so 14 or 15. His height was a trait of foreigners. His clothes looked like something a priest might wear, jet black vestments. However, there probably wasn't a soul in the world who would call this guy father. Perhaps because he was standing upwind, Kamijou caught a whiff of some way too sweet perfume, even though the man was more than 15 meters away. His shoulder-length blonde hair was dyed red like a sunset, and silver rings lined up on each of his fingers like brass knuckles. Gaudy earrings hung from his ears. A cell phone strap peeked from his pocket. A lit cigarette lounged in the corner of his mouth. And, to top it all off, a tattoo resembling a barcode was engraved under his lower right eyelid. Neither delinquent nor priest seemed to adequately describe this guy. But the man standing in the walkway clearly emanated an abnormal aura. Kamijou felt like the normal rules governing life no longer held sway, as if some entirely new set of physical laws had taken hold. He felt icy tentacles floating in the air around him. Neither terror nor anger took hold as his immediate reaction. It was once again hesitation. Hesitation and unease. It felt as if his wallet had been stolen in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. It was that kind of hopeless isolation. The icy tentacles probing the air took hold of his heart. It was then that he understood. This was a sorcerer. This world was now an abnormal environment, a world that supported the existence of sorcerers. He could tell at a glance. He didn't even believe in sorcerers. But this person clearly existed outside his world, the world in which his common sense applied. My, this certainly turned into a big show. The sorcerer looked around, making the cigarette twitch in the corner of his mouth. I heard Kanzaki had cut her, but... well, I thought things were okay because there wasn't any blood trail, but... The sorcerer noted the cleaning robots gathered behind Toma Kamijou. Index had probably been cut somewhere else and had run for her life. When she arrived here, her strength had failed. The droids, in the meantime, had neatly wiped away the trail of her fresh blood on the floor. But why? Huh? Oh, the reason she came back here? Who knows? Maybe she forgot something. Now that I think about it, she'd been wearing a hat when we shot her in the back yesterday. I wonder where she dropped that. The sorcerer in front of Kamijou had said that she came back. In other words, he'd been trailing Index the whole day. And he knew about her forgetting the hood of her habit, the walking church. Index had mentioned something along the lines of them searching for its magic power. So the sorcerers were tracking her by searching for the abnormal power inside her habit. Kamijou was pretty sure she'd also told them that they would know when the walking church had been destroyed and that its signal had been cut off. But Index should have understood what that meant too. She knew all of it, but she still tried to rely on the defensive prowess of her walking church. And why on earth did she come back? Why did she need to retrieve one piece of the shattered ineffectual habit? If the entire walking church had been rendered useless by Kamijou's right hand, then the hood would serve no purpose.
Alright, then are you willing to follow me into the depths of hell?
Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Kamijou remembered that he actually hadn't touched the last piece of the walking church. In other words, there was still magic power inside it. Index had figured that the sorcerers would use it to find her, so she'd braved the danger and come all the way back here. You idiot! She hadn't needed to do that. It was entirely his fault that the walking church had been destroyed, and he'd kept the hood in his room on purpose. She didn't have any duty, obligation, or authority to protect his life. But she wouldn't have been satisfied unless she returned. She'd been compelled to turn back for Toma Kamijou, a complete stranger whom she'd only known for 30 minutes. She risked her life so he wouldn't get involved in her battle with the sorcerers. She wouldn't have been satisfied unless she'd come back. You absolute idiot! Index wasn't moving an inch. It ticked him off for some reason. She had told him that his rotten luck was caused by his right hand. He was unconsciously erasing even fishy abnormal forces like the divine protection of God and the red thread of fate. If he hadn't carelessly touched her with his right hand, if the walking church hadn't been destroyed, then she wouldn't have come back. No, whatever. No need for excuses like that. Whatever his right hand was or wasn't, and whether or not the walking church was shattered, she hadn't needed to come back. If Kamijou hadn't wanted that connection. If he'd only returned the hood to her properly when he'd had the chance. Don't look at me like that. The sorcerer's cigarette twitched again. I wasn't the one who cut that, and I'm sure Kanzaki didn't mean to make it bleed so much. Everyone knows about the walking church's absolute defense, of course. It shouldn't have put a scratch on her. Man, how on earth did it end up getting broken anyway? The Dragon of St. George hasn't been resurrected yet, so it's impossible for a papal-class barrier to be torn down. His words ceased, as if he'd been muttering to himself, and his smile disappeared. But that was only for a moment. He started wiggling his cigarette again right away, as if he'd suddenly remembered the motion. Why? Why? Kamijou stammered, without thinking, without expecting an answer. Why? I don't believe in magic or fairy tales, and I can't understand you sorcerers. But don't you know the difference between good and evil? Don't you have something or someone you want to protect? He had no right to say that. He was nothing but a fraud. He'd allowed Index to go off on her own, returning to his daily life. But he just had to say this, no matter what. You all bullied a young girl, chased her around, and made her bleed like this! Can you really claim to have any sense of justice, you dick? I already said I wasn't the one who made it bleed. It was Kanzaki. The sorcerer cut him off plainly, unaffected by Kamijou's words in the slightest. Anyway, I'm picking up what I came here for, blood-soaked or otherwise. Picking up? Kamijou didn't understand. Oh, I see. I thought everything had been leaked, since you knew what a sorcerer was. He was probably scared of getting you involved in all this. The sorcerer exhaled a drag of cigarette smoke. That's right. I'm here to pick that up. To be more precise, I'm not here for that, but for the 103,000 grimoires it possesses. Again with the 103,000 grimoires? I see. You probably don't understand, since religion is pretty weak in this country. The sorcerer explained, his tone sounding bored despite the smile on his face. Index Librorum Prohibitorum. Translated, it means the Index of Forbidden Books. It's a list of wicked evil books published by the Church, which it insists would corrupt your soul if you read so much as a little. Even if the Church were to send out word that such dangerous books were in circulation, one of the vile tomes could still end up in someone's hands if the unwitting fool didn't know the title. So that was transformed into a crucible of poisonous knowledge, containing 103 bad books. You want to be careful. For someone like yourself, living in a country with feeble religious views, just looking at one would cripple you for life. Kamijou heard the sorcerer's diatribe, but Index still didn't have a single book with her. If she did, he would have been able to see it under her habit. He had, after all, seen every line on her body. Someone carrying 100,000 books wouldn't be able to walk anyway. 100,000 books was enough to fill an entire library. Quit messing with me! Where the hell are they then, huh? They're there, in that thing's head, in its memory. The sorcerer replied smoothly, as if stating the obvious. Have you ever heard of eidetic memory? Apparently it's an ability that lets you memorize anything the instant you see it. It's also called perfect recall, like a human scanner. The sorcerer smiled, still bored. We're not talking about our occult magic or your scientific supernatural abilities here. It's just a trait. It went to places around the world like the British Museum, the Musée du Louvre, the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticanica, the ruins of Pataliputra, the Château de Compiègne, and the Mount St. Michael Academy, and stole the grimoires sealed there using only its eyes. It is a library of grimoires. There was no way Kamijou could believe that. He couldn't believe in these grimoires or this perfect recall stuff. But it wasn't important whether or not they were true. In reality, there was a person right in front of him who'd slashed this girl's back because he believed it was true. Well, the girl herself can't train her magical power anyway, so she's harmless. The sorcerer rocked the cigarette around the corner of his mouth gleefully. The church must have a few ideas of their own, preparing a stopper like that. Well, I'm a sorcerer, so it doesn't have anything to do with me. Anyway, those 103,000 books are dangerous things, so before it falls into the hands of someone who will use it, I've come here to place it under my protective custody. Protection? Kamijou was flabbergasted. With this crimson landscape before him, what did this man just say? That's correct. That's right. Protective custody. However much common sense or goodwill she may have, she probably won't be able to stand up to torture and drugging. Thinking about handing over a girl's body to people like that just breaks your heart, doesn't it? Something in Kamijou's body was quaking. It wasn't simply anger. Goosebumps were breaking out on his arms. The man he was looking at truly believed that he was always right. His way of life was beyond reproach, never seeing his own faults. It made Kamijou feel as if he'd just lowered himself into a bathtub filled with 1,000 slugs. A chill surged through his entire body. The phrase lunatic cult came to mind. The sorcerer was hunting people out of blind faith without any sort of grounding or logic behind it. When Kamijou thought about that, his nerves snapped. You bastard! His right hand felt as if it surged with an intense heat, and it made a crackling sound as if resonating with his anger. His legs, once glued to the floor, moved faster than he could think. His dull body, made of flesh and blood, shot forward the sorcerer like a bullet. He clenched his right hand so tightly it seemed as if his intention was to crush his own fingers in his grip. His right hand was useless. It couldn't take down a single delinquent or raise his test scores or make him popular with the girls. But his right hand was very convenient because it was capable of punching the shit out of the prick standing in front of him. This would be the part where I introduce myself as Style Magnus, but I suppose I should call myself Pt.6 at this point. He casually twisted his mouth, his cigarette dancing at the motion. He muttered something to himself before declaring to Kamijou, as if bragging about his cool black cat. That's my magic name. Not used to hearing that? Apparently, we sorcerers mustn't reveal our true names when we are employing magic. It's an old convention, and I don't really get it. 15 meters separated them. Toma Kamijou halved the distance with just 3 steps. Fortis would be something like strong in Japanese, but the etymology doesn't matter. What's important is that I use this name to introduce myself. For sorcerers like me, it's less of a magic name and more of a... Toma Kamijou continued sprinting down the hall another 2 steps. The sorcerer kept smiling despite that, as if to imply his opponent wasn't someone capable of wiping away his smug grin. A killer name, perhaps? The sorcerer, Style Magnus, removed the cigarette from his mouth, flinging it aside with his fingers. The butt flew horizontally, slid along the metal railing, and struck the wall of the neighboring building. The orange trail of light outlined the trajectory of the cigarette, and when it hit the wall, embers scattered. Kenaz. As Style spoke, the orange afterimage suddenly exploded with a loud roar. The straight line became a flaming sword, as if expelled by a fire extinguisher filled with gasoline. Kamijou could hear the paint on the walls boiling and changing colors. It sounded like a photograph being roasted with a lighter. He hadn't even touched the sword, but Kamijou felt as if just looking at it would scald his eyes. He stopped automatically and covered his face with both hands. His legs weren't moving. It was as if they'd be hammered into the floor with a bang. Kamijou experienced doubt. The Imagine Breaker could erase any abnormal power with a single touch. Even the Biri girl Mikoto's railgun, a power conceivably capable of destroying an entire nuclear bunker with a single blast, was no exception. Still, Kamijou had never seen a supernatural force besides meta-human abilities. What about magic? Would his right hand work against magic? Completely unknown equation? Purisa is now P's Gebo! The sorcerer laughed through the hands Kamijou was using to cover his face. As he laughed, the white-hot fire blade seared into Toma Kamijou's side. On contact, it lost its cohesion and erupted indiscriminately like a volcanic torrent. It spewed waves of heat, flashes of light, explosions, and black smoke all around him. Did I overdo it? Styles scratched his head. The scene had just been bombed. He checked the surrounding area for bystanders beforehand. Most of the students who lived in this dormitory were probably out enjoying the first day of summer break, but if there were any friendless shut-ins still around, things would get complicated. A screen of black smoke and fire blanketed Styles' view, but he didn't need to bother checking to know what had happened. His attack was a hellfire that burned at 3,000 degrees Celsius. Apparently, above 2,000 degrees, human skin liquefies instead of burns, so the kid was probably a thick mass of ooze stuck to the wall like gum, just like the metal railing that had been melted like molten candy. He exhaled, realizing that his decision to draw the boy away from Index had been justified. If he had used the wounded Index as a shield, things would have gotten a little ugly. But he couldn't pick up Index like this. Styles sighed. He wasn't able to cross the flame-strewn hallway to retrieve her. If there were an emergency flight of stairs on the other side of the hallway, he could reach her, but if she melted in the flames while he went around, it wouldn't be funny. He shook his head, trying to work out how to proceed. As if he could see through the smoke, he spoke up again. Excellent job. Congratulations, but I'm sorry for your loss. If that's all you got, then you couldn't win even if you tried 1,000 times. Who couldn't win 1,000 times? The sorcerer froze, startled, at the voice emerging from the hellfire. With a massive roar, the fire and smoke obscuring the area were suddenly dispelled in a gust. It was as if a tornado had suddenly appeared in the center of the conflagration and blown everything away. In its place stood Toma Kamijou. The railing had liquefied like candy, the paint on the wall and floors was peeling, and the fluorescent lamps mounted on the ceiling dripped, having melted from the heat. In the eye of the inferno, the boy stood there, wholly unscathed. Jeez, of course. What was I so scared about? Kamijou uttered these words from the corner of his mouth, sounding bored. This was the right hand that destroyed Index's walking church. He honestly understood nothing about magic. Couldn't grasp the mechanisms of the thing of what was going on if he couldn't see it. Even if someone explained it to him from start to finish, he probably wouldn't understand half of it anyway. But stupid as he may have been, he did know one thing. In the end, it was just another abnormal power. The scarlet flames he'd expelled hadn't been completely extinguished. A neat circle of flame still crackled around Toma Kamijou. Out of the way! With this command, Kamijou touched the 3,000 degrees Celsius flames. The lot of them were expunged simultaneously, like birthday candles on a cake being blown out with a single breath. Kamijou sized up the sorcerer in front of him. The conjurer was confused at this clearly unanticipated turn of events, as any human would be. Oh, this thing was human. If he was punched, he'd feel pain, and if he was sliced with a 100-yen X-Acto knife, he'd bleed red blood. He was just a human being. Kamijou's knees no longer knocked, and his body was no longer frozen. He moved his limbs just as he always had. It moves. What? Style, on the other hand, almost backed away from the unexplainable phenomenon he had witnessed. Considering the environment around him, there was no way his attack could have misfired. Then was the boy's body strong enough to withstand temperatures over 3,000 degrees Celsius? No, he wouldn't even be human then. Toma Kamijou didn't stop to consider Styles' confusion. He slowly advanced one step at a time, clenching his hot right fist into a boulder. Damn! Style waved his arm horizontally. Another flaming sword appeared, just like the first, and slammed into Kamijou with explosive force. A detonation, flames and black smoke everywhere. But when the fire and brimstone dissipated, the boy was still standing. Again. Could he be using magic? Style considered the possibility, but immediately discounted it. There was no way there was a sorcerer in a foolish country that thought Christmas was a day for dating. Besides, If Index, who had no magical power, joined forces with a sorcerer, she'd have no need to flee. That was how dangerous her memories were. Possessing those 103,000 grimoires was fundamentally different from having something like a nuclear missile. Living things die, a suspended apple falls, 1 + 1 = 2. These were inviolable laws. But in fact, they could be broken, rewritten, and born anew. 1 + 1 would become 3, apples would fall up, and the dead would rise. Sorcerers called those the demon gods. Not a demon from hell, but rather a sorcerer who had trespassed into God's domain. A demonic god. But he could sense no magical power from the boy before him. As a sorcerer, he could tell with a glance. This kid didn't have the smell of someone from Styles' world. Then why? Ugh. As if in denial of the frigid sensation shooting down his spine, he conjured a third flaming sword and rammed it into Kamijou. This time there wasn't even an explosion. The instant Kamijou touched the fiery blade with his right hand, the entire thing shattered like glass, melted into the void, and disappeared. He did it as casually as swatting a fly. Ugh. For some reason, no real reason he could think of, something popped up in the back of Styles' mind. Index's habit, the walking church, was papal class, which meant it was absolute. The power of its defensive barrier rivaled those of London's cathedrals. As long as the legendary Dragon of St. George hadn't reappeared, destroying it was absolutely impossible. But Kanzaki had sliced Index, which meant the walking church had been shattered beyond recognition. But by who? And how? Toma Kamijou was already right in front of him. If he took one more step, he could punch the sorcerer. One of the 5 elemental components of the world, the fire of the beginning. A nervous sweat broke out all over Styles' body, because the living thing in front of him wearing a summer school uniform looked human. He sensed something else coiled within the boy's body, beyond the blood and the meat. Style felt his very spine shaking. It is born of life, and it is the arbiter of evil. It is mild happiness, and it is the bane of death. It is named fire, and it is my sword. I call thee into reality. Masticate my body for great power! The chest of Styles' vestments immediately expanded like a balloon. The buttons flew off, popped from within. As the flame devoured the oxygen with a roar, a giant ball of flame leaped from his clothing. Inside those brightly blazing flames was a core of thick petroleum-like bile. The core had the shape of a man. It looked like a human being covered in suffocating black oil, like a bird fallen victim to an oil spill. It burned incessantly. Its name was Innocentius, the Witch Hunter King, and its very name implied certain death. The flaming giant with inevitable death's moniker spread its arms and charged at Toma Kamijou like a bullet. Out of the way! Delivering a simple backhand with all the annoyance of brushing through a spiderweb, Toma Kamijou swatted away the sorcerer's final trump card. The oil-drenched human figure of the flaming giant sprayed out in all directions, like a water balloon pierced by a needle. Huh? Just then, Kamijou decided not to take that last step forward. There was no logic behind his decision. Style, whose last gambit had been eradicated, was smiling, and that made Kamijou hesitate to take that final step carelessly. Suddenly, he heard the squelching sound of jelly coming from every direction. What? He took a step back, startled, and the black spray reconstructed itself in midair, once again taking on a human form. If he had taken that last step, the giant's flames would have encircled his entire body for sure. Kamijou was confused. If what he knew about the Imagine Breaker was true, then it could destroy even divine miracles with a single blow. As long as this sorcerer's attack was a magical abnormal power, he should have been able to nullify it with a touch. Inside the flames, the thick, oily figure writhed, changed shape, and transformed into the silhouette of a person gripping a sword with both hands. No, it was no sword. It was a giant cross more than 2 meters tall that looked as if a man could be crucified on it. The demon wielded the cross in a large arc, bringing it down on Kamijou's head like a pickaxe. Ugh! Kamijou grunted and immediately shielded himself from the blow with his right hand. After all, he was just a regular high schooler. He lacked the combat skills to see an attack like that coming and avoid it. The cross collided with his right hand with a giant metallic crash. This time it didn't disappear. Instead, Kamijou felt a slight resistance to his grip, as if he was squeezing a rubber ball. The enemy used both hands, but Kamijou could only use one. Millimeter by millimeter, the flaming cross edged closer to his face. Panicked, Kamijou only just barely noticed. This ball of fire, Innocentius, the Witch Hunter King, was definitely reacting to his Imagine Breaker. But no sooner was it destroyed than it managed to resurrect itself. The interval between destruction and revival was probably no more than 1/100th of a second. His right hand was trapped. If he freed it for even an instant, he would immediately be reduced to ash.
Runes.
Toma Kamijou heard something. He couldn't turn around to look behind him due to the crisis in front of him consuming his attention, but he immediately recognized the voice.
24 letters that describe mysteries and secrets. A magical language employed by Germanic tribes since the 2nd century, in which Old English is said to have its roots.
He knew it was Index, but he couldn't believe it. What? How can she be speaking so calmly when her body's wrecked and drenched in blood?
Attacking the Witch Hunter King will have no effect. The walls, floor, and ceiling. As long as the inscribed runic seals surrounding us remain intact, it will be reborn ad infinitum.
Toma Kamijou was only barely able to stop the cross's advance by bracing his right wrist with his left hand. Very slowly, he turned his head. A solitary girl was still curled up where she'd fallen, but he couldn't call that Index. Its eyes were like a machine's, utterly devoid of emotion. With every word it spoke, blood seeped from the wound in its back. It was unfazed, nothing more than a system created for the sole purpose of explaining magic. You're Index, right?
Yes, I am the Library of Grimoires belonging to Necessarius, the Church of Necessary Evils, the 0th parish of the English Puritan Church. My proper name is Index Librorum Prohibitorum, but you may call me Index for short.
Kamijou felt a tremendous chill as he considered the life of the Library of Grimoires, the index of prohibited books. It was nearly enough to make him forget about Innocentius, who was currently trying to kill him.
If introductions are complete, I shall return to my explanation of runic magic. To put it simply, it is comparable to the moon reflected in a pool of water at night. No matter how much one slices the water's surface with a sword, the moon will remain unaffected. If you wish to cut the moon reflected in the water's surface, you must first direct your blade toward the real moon floating in the night sky.
Index's lesson was complete. Kamijou finally remembered Innocentius, the enemy before him. So then this wasn't the actual aberrant force? Then it was like destroying a photograph, but not the negatives. Unless he destroyed the actual abnormal power manifesting the flame giant, it would continue reviving forever. Was that what she meant? At this point, Kamijou still didn't believe what she was saying. Even though he'd come this far, his common sense still screamed that magic wasn't real. Anyway, with his right arm sealed by Innocentius and his body immobilized, he couldn't have tried a different tactic even if he wanted to, and asking the blood-soaked Index for help seemed like an unlikely prospect. Ashes to ashes. Behind the giant flaming god, Style manifested another sword with his right hand. And dust to dust. A second sword, this one white-hot, appeared soundlessly in his left. "Squeamish bloody rude!" shouted the sorcerer, trudging forward, his blazing sabers held parallel to the ground like a pair of scissors, as if he intended to slice through the flaming giant as well. Kamijou stood helpless to defend with his right hand occupied by the witch-hunting king. "Oh shit, gotta run!" Before Kamijou could so much as scream, the two fiery swords collided with the infernal behemoth and ignited like a bomb, engulfing Kamijou in the conflagration. To read a certain magical index, buy the book. There's a link in the description. Okay, so I am most likely not going to be continuing reading the series. I will maybe if I will put a special comment in the comment section below. That will contain the instructions for if anything really does want me to continue reading the series. If the conditions are met, most likely, when I say most likely, 65% chance, if I were to round it. 65% chance that I will continue reading a certain magical index. But for now, I will not continue it. I'm just going to continue with Log Horizon, and my youth romantic comedy is as wrong as I expected.